She walked into that good-class bungalow in an apron, her hair tied up, pretending to be someone she wasn't, because it was the only way to get close to the son who was being destroyed without knowing it. What Helen discovered within those walls changed the entire course of the story. Helen carried the kind of pain that doesn't show on a face. That dull, deep ache a mother bears when she senses something is wrong with her child and can't get close enough to confirm it. For months, she had been trying to speak with Ryan. She'd call in the morning, call in the afternoon, send messages, leave voicemails, and always a polite, short reply would appear, with Vivian's voice or text in the middle saying he was in a meeting, that he was traveling, that he was fine, and would call as soon as he could. Ryan never called, and Helen gradually stopped believing the excuses. She wasn't a woman who made a scene. She had raised her son alone, working as a cleaner in people's homes, waking before the sun and sleeping after everyone else, without asking for favors and without bowing to anyone. She had taught Ryan that honest work builds anything, and he had proven he'd learned well. He built a company from scratch, grew it, became a leader in his sector, and bought the GCB that Vivian had chosen, the one Helen had never been properly invited to see. She had visited once, right after the wedding, and Vivian had been cordial in that hurtful way, that cold cordiality of someone fulfilling a protocol and waiting for you to leave. Since that day, the invitations never came again. It was Marcus who unintentionally opened the door. He called Helen on an ordinary afternoon, wanting to know if she had any news of Ryan, because he was also having trouble reaching his friend. In the middle of the conversation, he mentioned he'd seen in a neighborhood WhatsApp group that they were looking for a part-time helper at the bungalow through an agency. He said it without thinking, just to fill the silence. But Helen heard it and went quiet for a few seconds, her heart racing. That night, she didn't sleep, just thought, and by morning she knew what she was going to do. The agency was on the other side of the island. Helen arrived early, before any other candidates, with her hair in a tight bun, no earrings, no necklace, wearing a simple blouse, and with the posture of someone who had done this kind of work her whole life, because she had. She introduced herself with a different name, using her mother's maiden name that few knew, and answered every question with the confidence of someone who didn't need to invent anything, because she was talking about a real life. She was approved in less than an hour. The agent said the position was urgent, and the interview with the employer would be the next day. Helen left the agency with the address in her hand and a knot in her stomach she recognized. It was the same feeling from when Ryan was little and would get sick in the middle of the night. That maternal clenching that mixes fear with determination and, in the end, becomes courage. The bungalow was exactly what she imagined. Too big for two people, too closed off to be a real home. The gate was high, the garden was perfect. The flowers were the kind that someone tends to, but no one picks. Helen entered through the service door, as the rules dictated, and waited on a plastic chair in the back corridor, while Vivian finished doing God knows what inside. When Vivian appeared, Helen needed all the control she had not to let anything show on her face. Her daughter-in-law was impeccable, with sleek hair, an upright posture, and a gaze that assessed everything in seconds. She looked Helen up and down with the speed of someone accustomed to judging the value of things by their appearance, and began asking questions without even introducing herself. She wanted to know about previous experience, availability, if she had references, if she lived far away, if she had children who might interfere with her work. Helen answered everything calmly, at the right pace, without anxiety or subservience, just with the natural dignity of someone who knows who she is, even when she's pretending to be someone else. Vivian signed the paperwork without looking Helen in the eye a second time and said before turning to leave, "You start tomorrow morning. Auntie Susan will show you the routine." I don't like to repeat myself. There was no handshake, no name, no human glance. Helen nodded and said she would be there. Auntie Susan was waiting in the kitchen when Helen arrived the next day. She was a woman with gray hair, hands thick from decades of work, and a look that said much more than her mouth was willing to speak. She showed her the rooms, explained the routine, taught her where everything was, and all the while she watched Helen with an attention that wasn't common between people who had just met. It was as if she were looking for something in her face, as if trying to confirm an intuition. At the end of the house tour, when the two were alone in the laundry area, Auntie Susan stopped, looked around, and spoke softly, "You're not a helper." Helen didn't answer immediately. She looked at the other woman and saw it wasn't an accusation, it was a recognition. "I am, for as long as I need to be," Helen replied. Auntie Susan was quiet for a moment, then she nodded slowly, like someone who had just made an important decision, and started walking again as if nothing had been said. The bungalow had a routine that seemed normal on the outside, but felt wrong on the inside. Vivian left every morning after Ryan went to work, always well-dressed, always in a hurry, always with a different story about where she was going. She would return before lunch, change her clothes, and when Ryan arrived at the end of the day, she would be sitting in the living room as if she had never left. It was a performance. Helen recognized it, because she had spent years observing people in other people's homes and had learned early on that the difference between a happy home and a home pretending to be happy wasn't in the furniture, it was in the air. The air in that bungalow was heavy. Ryan arrived that first night around 8. Helen was clearing the last items from the kitchen when she heard the main door open. She kept her back to it, her hands busy, and waited. She heard his footsteps, slower than she remembered, heavier, like someone carrying something they can't name. She heard Vivian greet him with a voice that changed tone when he was near, softer, more calculated, and then he came into the kitchen for water. Helen had her back to him. She could hear her son's breathing less than 2 meters away. She felt her throat tighten and her eyes sting, not from sadness, but from that love that hurts because it's too big to fit in one's chest. She turned her body slowly, head down, and left the kitchen without raising her face. Ryan didn't recognize her. Of course, he didn't. She was a new helper, in an apron, head bowed, on another exhausting day for a man being consumed from the inside, without understanding why. Helen went to the small room Vivian had assigned her. She closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floor for a time she couldn't measure. Then she took a deep breath, stood up, and went to the small window that overlooked the back garden. It was then that she heard it. Vivian was on the veranda on the other side of the house, speaking on the phone in a low, firm voice that the night's silence carried to Helen with disturbing clarity. "He'll sign whatever I tell him to. Don't worry, I'll handle my part. No one will find out anything." Helen stood frozen, her hand on the window, and her heart in her throat. No one would find out anything. But she was already inside. The first ray of sunlight had not yet appeared when Helen was already on her feet. It wasn't insomnia. It was that state of alertness a mother develops after years of listening to every noise in the house, every different breath, every silence that shouldn't be silent. She had slept little and thought a lot, and when the clock showed it was time to start, she got up without hesitation and went to the kitchen as if the place had been hers for years. The bungalow's routine started early. Auntie Susan arrived before everyone else, opened the windows in the service area, put the coffee on, and started organizing things with the automatic movements of someone who has repeated the same gestures for so long that her body no longer needs to think. Helen fitted into this routine without making noise, without asking unnecessary questions, without drawing attention. She quickly learned where everything was, the time for each meal, what Vivian liked to find ready when she came downstairs, and what Ryan drank before leaving for work. It was tea, every day, before anything else. Ryan had a cup of tea that Vivian prepared personally. Helen noticed this on the second day. There was something in that gesture that was out of place. Vivian was not a woman who did anything in the kitchen. She didn't touch a pan, didn't open the fridge, didn't know where the cutlery was, but she prepared the tea. Always her, always before Ryan came down. And she always left the cup covered on the counter, waiting. Helen stored this observation within herself, without saying anything to anyone. It was on the third day that Auntie Susan began to really talk. Not all at once, but in pieces, like someone releasing a weight, bit by bit, afraid of stumbling if they let it all go at once. She started while the two of them were cleaning the second-floor corridor, far from any cameras, far from any ears. Auntie Susan spoke softly, her back to Helen, wiping the same spot on the floor for the third time. She said that before Helen, there had been 3 helpers in less than a year. The first left after a week, saying the atmosphere of the house made her uncomfortable and she couldn't explain why. The second was fired after being seen coming out of the corridor near Vivian's office. Vivian said she was snooping and sent her home that very day, with no chance to explain. The third stayed for almost 2 months. She was an older, quiet Filipina who did her job without trouble and didn't ask questions, but one day she disappeared. Auntie Susan arrived in the morning and her room was empty, the bed made as if it had never been used. Vivian just said she had resigned during the night and left. No one saw her leave. No one had any contact with her afterwards. Helen listened to it all without interrupting. When Auntie Susan finished, she was silent for a few seconds and then asked carefully, "Did you try to talk to Ryan about any of this?" Auntie Susan stopped wiping, but didn't turn around. "Once," she said. "Just once. I went to him in the study when she wasn't home and tried to say I was worried about some things I was seeing. He listened to me, but his eyes were distant, as if the words were reaching him but not quite fitting together. He just looked at me the way a tired child does, present and absent at the same time. Then she came home earlier than expected, and I left. That night, Vivian called me to the kitchen and said with that smile of hers that good staff do their job and don't create stories, and that she was sure I was good staff. Helen felt a chill run up her spine. "And you kept quiet after that?" "I did," Auntie Susan confirmed, finally turning around. Her eyes were full. "I have a family to support. I'm scared. But I also have a lot of things stored up inside here that have been weighing me down for a long time." That afternoon, while Vivian was out, as she was every afternoon, with the same usual haste and the same vague story of an appointment, Helen took the opportunity to do something she had planned the night before. She went to the laundry room, opened the cabinet where the cleaning products were kept, and began to search calmly, moving each item carefully so as not to leave anything out of place. She was about to give up when she found it. At the back of the cabinet, behind a large bottle of bleach and a pack of folded cloths, there was a brown manila envelope, yellowed at the edges, the kind that has been hidden for too long. Helen took it, checked that she was alone, and opened it. They were photos, 5 of them, printed on plain paper, slightly faded. 3 showed a man Helen didn't know, middle-aged, well-dressed, always in dark glasses, in different places, on different days. In one photo, he was near the entrance of an office building. In another, he was sitting at a restaurant table. In the third, he was standing on the pavement in front of a bank, looking to the side. The other 2 photos were of documents. They looked like bank statements, with numbers Helen couldn't fully decipher, but they had Vivian's name at the top. Someone had gathered these photos for a purpose. Someone had stored that envelope in there either with the intention of it being found or with the intention of it not being. Helen didn't yet know which was true. She tucked the envelope inside her clothes, went to the service toilet, and stood there for a moment, looking at her own face in the mirror. This was much deeper than she thought. Ryan came home earlier that night. Helen was sweeping the entrance hall when she heard the door open and footsteps enter without the usual end-of-day wait. She didn't move, just continued sweeping with her head slightly tilted. And for the first time since she had arrived in that house, she was able to observe her son up close, for a moment, without having to immediately look away. What she saw squeezed her heart in a way she hadn't expected. Ryan was thin, not in a way that would show up in a photo or that someone would notice in a quick conversation, but in the way a mother notices, the kind that shows in the face, the neck, the way his shirt hung on his shoulders. His hands, when he placed his keys on the console table, trembled slightly, an almost imperceptible tremor. But Helen saw it. His eyes were sunken, with that paleness around them that isn't from work fatigue, it's an exhaustion from within. He didn't greet Helen, not because he was rude, she knew he wasn't, but because he simply didn't see her. He walked past, looking at the floor, went up the stairs slowly, and disappeared upstairs. A few minutes later, Vivian arrived, and it was as if someone had turned on all the lights in the house at once. She came in talking, threw her handbag on the sofa with a movement that seemed rehearsed to appear casual, went up the stairs calling Ryan's name with that voice that changed timbre when he was around, softer, more enveloping, like something from a drama series. Helen heard everything from the hallway and stood quietly with the broom in her hand. Later, during the dinner she served in silence, she observed the 2 of them at the table. Vivian talked, gestured, laughed at calculated moments. Ryan responded little, ate even less, and sometimes just stared at his plate with a vacant expression, as if trying to remember something that kept slipping away every time he got close. When Helen collected the dessert bowls, she passed behind Ryan and, for a fraction of a second, without anyone seeing, she placed her hand lightly on the back of his chair. She didn't touch him, but she was there for a second that lasted much longer than a second. Then she went to the kitchen to wash the dishes, her eyes burning. The night arrived heavy and quiet. Helen was lying with her eyes open when she heard it. At first, she thought it was the wind or a noise from the street, but the sound continued muffled, irregular, coming from upstairs with the unmistakable quality of someone trying not to be heard. It was crying. The crying of a man who doesn't want to cry, the kind that comes out in broken pieces, stifled, interrupted, as if the person were at war with his own feelings and losing. It was Ryan. Helen lay there, listening to her son cry in the upstairs bathroom, unable to do anything, unable to go up, unable to knock on the door and say she was there, that she had always been there, that she was never going anywhere. She lay with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, her hand clenched on the sheet until the crying stopped. When the house returned to silence, She stayed like that for a little longer. Then she took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and was about to succumb to sleep when she heard the soft knock on her door. 3 light, discreet knocks from someone not wanting to wake the house. Helen got up and opened it. Auntie Susan was outside, her face pale, with the eyes of someone who hadn't slept. She had something in her hands, an old notebook covered in yellowed transparent plastic, the kind used to protect school books. She held it out to Helen, saying nothing for a few seconds. Then she spoke so softly Helen had to lean in to hear. It belonged to the girl who worked here before me. She left it hidden inside the mattress in this room before she left. I only found it weeks later when I changed the mattress. I read a part of it and I couldn't continue. Read it carefully and don't let anyone see. Helen took the notebook with both hands. Auntie Susan looked both ways down the corridor, turned her back, and disappeared silently into the darkness. Helen closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and placed the notebook in her lap. The cover was worn, the edges frayed. Inside were pages and pages of small, cramped handwriting, written with the urgency of someone needing to record things before memory or courage ran out. She opened it to the first page and began to read. The handwriting was tiny and tight, the kind the hand makes when the mind is racing faster than the fingers can keep up. Helen read the first line 3 times before she could absorb what it said. Not because it was hard to understand, but because the weight of those words needed a moment to land. If anyone finds this, please, don't ignore it. I tried to speak up, and no one listened to me. Helen took a deep breath and continued. The woman who had written the notebook was named Teresa. She had worked at the bungalow for almost 2 months. She had come through the same agency, gone through the same cold interview with Vivian, and slept in the same beige-walled room where Helen now sat. Teresa wrote with a raw honesty, without unnecessary drama or embellishment. Just the facts, in the order they happened, like someone who knows they might not have much time and needs to be clear. In the first few pages, she described the house routine, Vivian's behavior, the daily absences, the hidden phone calls, things Helen had already observed on her own. But from the 5th page on, the tone of the account changed. Teresa had noticed the tea. She wrote that at first, she thought it was normal. A couple, a routine, a husband who likes tea before he leaves. But one morning when Vivian had left earlier than usual, Teresa was in the kitchen when Ryan came down and asked where his tea was. She said she would make it, and he, without thinking, replied that it wasn't necessary, that he didn't even like tea that much. But Vivian insisted so much that it had become a habit. Helen stopped reading, staring at that sentence for a long moment. He didn't even like tea that much. A simple sentence, one that meant nothing on its own. But inside that notebook, after everything Teresa had described before, it meant everything. She continued reading. Teresa had started paying attention to the tea. She observed that Vivian always prepared it with the kitchen door closed, which wasn't standard, as the bungalow's kitchen was an open concept design. She observed that the preparation took longer than it should for a simple cup, and she observed that after a few weeks of drinking that tea every day, Ryan had begun to change slower in his responses, more distant in his eyes, sleeping more than usual on weekends, waking up with headaches he attributed to overwork. Teresa had written in the notebook with even tighter handwriting in that section. I don't know what is in that tea, but I know it's not just tea. Helen closed the notebook for a moment and placed her hand on it, as if she needed to contain what was inside. The room was dark, the bungalow was silent, and outside, the early morning was indifferent to it all. She stayed like that for a few seconds, not paralyzed, but reorganizing, because there was a difference between suspecting and having confirmation. And that notebook was pushing her from suspicion to confirmation with a speed her heart could barely keep up with. She opened it again and read to the end. In the last pages, Teresa described her attempt to talk to Ryan, a quick conversation in the hallway when Vivian wasn't there. She said he listened to her with that vacant expression Helen already knew. He agreed he had been feeling strange lately and promised to pay attention. 2 days later, Teresa was called in by Vivian and dismissed without explanation. She didn't give a reason. She just told me I could go, with that smile of hers, the one that doesn't reach her eyes. The last sentence of the notebook was short. I left because I was scared, but I regret leaving every single day. Helen tucked the notebook inside her pillowcase and lay there, eyes open, until the sky outside began to lighten. When she got up, she had a plan. That morning, she went to the kitchen earlier than usual. Auntie Susan hadn't arrived yet. The bungalow was quiet, with that pre-dawn silence that the morning light had not yet dissolved. Helen went straight to the pantry, opened it quietly, and began moving items one by one, slowly, without rush, without noise. She was almost at the last shelf when she found it. It was a small, transparent glass bottle with no label and a black screw-top lid. Inside was a slightly dark liquid, less than a finger's height, almost unnoticeable if you weren't looking for it. Helen didn't touch it with her hands. She took a small plastic bag that was folded in a nearby drawer, carefully wrapped the bottle, and took out a minuscule amount with a coffee spoon, which she then threw away. She kept the sample, put the bottle back exactly where it was, same position, same angle, same space between the other items, and left the pantry before the house began to wake. Later, when she went to the market to get the items on Vivian's list, she found a small sample container at a nearby pharmacy, put the substance inside, and sealed it. Back at the bungalow, she waited for the right moment and sent a message to Dr. Leong, a doctor who had treated her years ago, a serious and discreet man she knew wouldn't ask unnecessary questions before helping. She wrote only, "Need you to analyze this urgently. It's serious. Please don't mention this to anyone." Then she went to clean the upstairs as if nothing had happened. It was the next day that Vivian began to watch her differently. It was nothing that could be easily named. Not an accusation, not a direct question. It was a look. The kind of look someone gives when they're trying to fit a piece that doesn't quite match. Vivian spent the day moving around the house with that presence that filled the space. And on 3 separate occasions, Helen felt her daughter-in-law's eyes rest on her for too long. The third time, Helen was sweeping the entrance hall. Vivian stopped a few meters away, phone in hand but not looking at it, and said with a very practiced lightness, "Where are you from again?" "From the Heartlands," Helen replied without pausing the broom. "Heartlands, where?" "A small town. The name wouldn't mean anything to someone who isn't from there." Vivian stared for a few more seconds. "You look familiar to me. I swear I've had this feeling since you arrived." Helen lifted her face and met her daughter-in-law's gaze with an absolutely neutral expression. "It must be your imagination. I have a very common face." Vivian gave a smile that wasn't a smile and walked away. Helen waited for the footsteps to fade down the corridor and only then let the broom rest against the wall, so her hand had something to hold onto. That afternoon, while hanging laundry in the yard, her phone vibrated in her apron pocket. It was Dr. Leong. Helen looked around, went to the farthest corner of the yard, near the wall covered in creeping vines, and opened the message. The doctor had written 3 lines, only 3. But every word of those 3 lines was heavy enough to change everything. He had identified the substance. He said it was a compound used under strict control in specific medical contexts, and that in low, continuous doses over time, it affected clarity of thought, recent memory, and the judgment of the person ingesting it. He said the effects were gradual, almost imperceptible day to day, but cumulative, and they my last line, with the objectivity of someone choosing their words very carefully. "Helen, whoever is taking this needs to stop, and you need to call me today." Helen stood there with the phone in her hand, the afternoon sun hitting her face, as if the world outside had no idea what was happening inside that yard. Ryan had been dosed for weeks. The distance, the trembling hands, the unexplained crying in the bathroom, the eyes that didn't focus properly, it all had a reason, and the reason had a name. She put her phone away, picked up a bedsheet still in the basket, and began to hang it with hands that didn't tremble, because Helen had learned very early in life that there are times the body must keep functioning, even when the heart is in pieces. But inside, something had changed. She was no longer just investigating, she was now in a race. Helen didn't call Dr. Leong that afternoon, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew that if she opened her mouth to speak about it aloud, something inside her would break before it was time. And she couldn't afford to break now. She had to stay on her feet. She had to continue being the helper in the apron who sweeps the hall and lowers her head when Vivian passes. She sent a short message, "Received, understand everything, we'll speak to you soon." She put the phone away and went to prepare dinner. The night inside the bungalow had a different weight than the others. Vivian was quieter than usual. She spent most of the time in the second-floor study with the door closed, which was unusual. Ryan arrived at the usual time, ate little, talked even less, and went to bed before 10. Helen cleared the table, washed the dishes, turned off the kitchen lights, and went to her room, her mind fuller than it had ever been. She lay down, staring at the ceiling, and that's when the memory came. It wasn't gradual, it was all at once, like those memories that are stored somewhere deep and suddenly surface, without permission. Helen was staring at the ceiling of the helper's room in the bungalow, but she was seeing something else. She was seeing the void deck of the HDB block, where she had raised Ryan, the flats packed together, the children playing on the walkway, while mothers chatted at their doorways. She was seeing Serene with her dark hair, easy smile, always with a story on the tip of her tongue. They had been neighbors for years, not close friends, but the kind who help each other out when needed, who hold a spare key for each other, who lend an egg when you run out in the middle of cooking lunch. Serene had 2 young daughters and a husband who was rarely around. She lived on a tight budget, complained a lot, but had that expansive way about her that made people like her before they really knew her. Helen remembered the day she began to realize something was wrong. A neighbor stopped her at the void deck with an embarrassed look and asked if she had managed to pay back what she'd borrowed. Helen didn't understand. The neighbor explained. She said Serene had asked for money in Helen's name, saying she was going through a tough time and was too ashamed to ask directly. Helen felt the ground shift. She started asking other people in the block and discovered, one conversation at a time, that Serene had done this with at least 8 different families, always using Helen's name, always with a different story, always promising to pay it back on behalf of someone who didn't even know her name was being used. Helen had tried to talk to Serene before doing anything else. She knocked on her door, waited, tried again. Serene opened it on the 3rd try, her eyes darting away, her voice defensive before Helen even said a word. The conversation did not go well. Serene denied it, then downplayed it, then cried, then accused Helen of exaggerating, of trying to destroy her reputation, of being an envious neighbor who couldn't stand to see others do well. Helen had told the neighbors the truth, not out of malice, but because her name was being used, her reputation was being destroyed, and she had no other way to defend herself. She presented the names, the amounts, the stories each had heard. The truth spoke for itself. Serene lost everything she had built in that neighborhood in a matter of days, and left with her young daughters, without saying where she was going, screaming words that Helen heard from the walkway and never forgot. Now, lying in the darkness of her son's bungalow, Helen closed her eyes and tried to do the calculation that her heart had already been making before her head caught up. Serene had 2 daughters. Vivian had a younger sister. Vivian's surname, which she had seen on the agency documents, which had always seemed familiar in a way she couldn't place, was Serene's husband's surname. Helen opened her eyes. She lay motionless for a long moment, as that certainty settled in her chest, like something that had always been there but needed time to find its place. Vivian was Serene's daughter, and she hadn't come to Ryan by chance. In the dead of night, Helen got up, went to the window, and stared at the dark garden without seeing anything. She was trying to grasp the scale of it, not just what Vivian had done, but why. A child who grew up hearing from her mother that Helen had destroyed their family. A child who became an adult carrying that as the truth, who studied, planned, researched, found Helen's son, and decided she would take everything he had as a way of settling a score that was never real. And Ryan was in the middle of it all, knowing nothing. Helen felt a pain that wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, more complicated. The pain of understanding that her son had been used as an instrument in a story that began before he existed. That the years he had spent beside Vivian, the decisions he had made, the distance from his mother he had accepted, all of it had been built on a lie that a woman told her own daughters to avoid facing her own mistakes. She stood at the window until she felt she could breathe properly again. Then she went to the bed, picked up her phone, and sent a message to Marcus. She didn't explain anything. She just said she needed to talk to him, that it was urgent, and that he couldn't mention it to Ryan or Vivian. She asked him to come to the bungalow in the next few days with any excuse that seemed natural. Marcus replied in less than 2 minutes, which confirmed what Helen already suspected. He was awake, and someone who is awake in the middle of the night with their phone in hand, waiting for a message, is also carrying something heavy. His reply was short, but it said a lot. "I've known something is wrong for a long time. You can count on me. I'll be there." Helen looked at the message for a few seconds, then put her phone away and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. And it was in that moment, in the complete silence of the night, that she heard something she shouldn't have been hearing. Footsteps in the upstairs corridor, slow, unsteady, heading towards the stairs. Helen positioned herself so she was hidden by the shadow of the refrigerator and waited. The steps came down the stairs carefully, someone trying not to make noise but having trouble moving with normal coordination. And when the figure reached the kitchen entrance and the dim light from the garden illuminated his face, Helen saw it was Ryan. His eyes were half open, with the expression of someone not fully awake but not asleep either. He stood at the entrance to the kitchen, staring into space for a few seconds. Then he spoke, not to Helen, because he hadn't seen Helen. He spoke to the darkness in a low, hoarse voice she barely recognized as her son's. "Mummy." Just that. One word, let loose in the dark kitchen in the middle of the night, like someone calling for a person who is no longer there. Helen stood motionless, her hand on the counter, her eyes full. Ryan stood for a few more seconds, then turned slowly and went back upstairs with the same unsteady steps. Helen heard the footsteps fade, heard the silence return, and stood there in the dark kitchen, unable to move for a time she couldn't measure. Her son was calling for her without knowing she was there. He was calling for her without knowing she had entered that house, given up everything, put on an apron, and swallowed her own pride. All for him, all to get close enough to protect him from something he couldn't see. Helen dried her eyes with the back of her hand and made the decision she had been postponing since she first set foot in that house. She couldn't wait for the perfect moment anymore. She couldn't gather one more piece of evidence, build one more argument, plan one more step. Ryan was calling for his mother in the dark, and his mother was there, a few meters away, pretending to be someone else. This was going to end. Soon, it was going to end. Helen woke before her alarm with the clarity of someone who hadn't truly slept, but had rested enough to act. She lay still for exactly 1 minute she counted, and in that minute, she went over everything she was going to do, in order, without rush and without hesitation. Then she got up, washed her face, looked at her own reflection in the small mirror above the sink, and said softly to herself something her own mother used to say when a situation was too difficult to face with closed eyes. "Open your eyes, straighten your spine, and go." She went. The morning began just like all the others. Coffee, routine, Vivian coming downstairs looking impeccable, Ryan leaving for work with his shoulders slumped and his eyes not quite focusing. Helen served, cleared, cleaned, and at no point did she let her face betray what was happening inside. But before Ryan left, Helen did something she hadn't done on the previous days. As he passed through the hall with his briefcase in hand, she was standing near the window with a dishcloth and said in a calm, direct voice, without looking at him, "Sir, you forgot your phone on the kitchen counter." Ryan stopped, looked at her, went back to get his phone, and when he passed her again, for a fraction of a second, his eyes rested on Helen's face with a different kind of hesitation than all the other times. It wasn't recognition yet. It wasn't that feeling the body has before the memory finds its way. It was like when a smell transports you to a place you can't name but know in some inexplicable way. Ryan left without saying anything. Helen stood there with the dishcloth in her hand, her heart beating out of rhythm. Marcus arrived before lunch. Helen had arranged with him to use the excuse of a document that needed Ryan's signature. Something simple, believable, that wouldn't arouse suspicion. But when the intercom buzzed and Vivian answered, Helen stood on the other side of the wall, listening to the conversation, and noticed that Vivian let Marcus in without much questioning. This worried her more than if she had refused. A Vivian who doesn't question is a Vivian who is calculating. Marcus entered through the main living area, and Helen saw him for the first time in a long while. He looked different, tense, with that expression of someone carrying something heavier than their body can hide. When his eyes met Helen's a helper, he shouldn't know he held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds without blinking, then looked away. Perfect. They had agreed on this in their messages. Vivian left them in the living room and went upstairs, saying she would tell Ryan that Marcus was there. Helen approached Marcus, speaking quickly and quietly. "Did you bring it?" "Brought everything," he replied in the same tone, his hand in the inner pocket of his jacket. "Bank statements, contracts, ACRA records showing unauthorized changes, and one more thing you didn't ask for, but you need to see later. For now, stay here and don't hand anything over until I give the signal." Marcus nodded. Helen returned to the corridor. Ryan arrived earlier than Vivian expected. Marcus had called him before coming, without revealing the real reason, just saying he needed to talk about something company-related in person, that it couldn't be over the phone. Ryan had left his meeting midway and come straight over. When he walked through the front door and saw Marcus in the living room, he hugged his friend with the kind of embrace. Vivian came down the stairs a few minutes later, and when she saw Ryan there before the expected time, something flashed across her face so quickly that only someone paying very close attention would have seen it. Helen was paying very close attention. Vivian recalibrated in seconds, smiled, went to Ryan, and placed a hand on his arm with the kind of naturalness that comes from rehearsing a gesture until it becomes a reflex. "Love, what a surprise. I didn't know you were coming home early." Marcus said it was important. "Of course, I'll have them bring some coffee." She turned to call for Helen, and when her eyes met Helen's in the corridor, she paused for half a second. It wasn't the look of a boss to a helper. It was the look of someone adding 2 and 2 and not liking the result. "You can bring the coffee," Vivian said slowly. "Yes, ma'am." Helen went to the kitchen, stayed in there for exactly the time it took to prepare the coffee, and used those minutes to retrieve the envelope of photos she had kept in her bag since the day she found it in the laundry room. She placed the envelope inside her apron, took a deep breath, and returned to the living room. What happened in the next few minutes, Helen had planned. But what she felt while it was happening, no amount of planning in the world could have prepared her for it. She placed the tray on the coffee table. Ryan and Marcus were sitting on the sofa, Vivian in an armchair to the left, legs crossed, smile in place. Helen stood by the table for a moment, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she took off her apron. Vivian frowned. "What are you, Helen?" Let down her hair and turned to face Ryan. The silence that fell over the room was the kind that precedes something big. Ryan looked at her, and this time it wasn't the fraction of a second from the corridor, not the nameless flicker from before. It was full recognition, arriving all at once, like a jammed door, suddenly giving way. He stood up so fast that the cup on the table rattled. Mummy. This time it wasn't in the dead of night, lost and unaware she was there. It was with his eyes wide open and his voice broken, and the 2 steps he took to reach her were the fastest and slowest steps Helen had ever seen in her life. The hug Ryan gave his mother was the kind that needs no words. It was the hug of a son who had been drowning without knowing it, and had just realized there was ground beneath his feet. Helen closed her eyes and held her son with a strength she didn't know she still had. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Vivian said nothing during this time. She remained in the armchair, her smile frozen on her face, processing. It was Ryan who broke the hug first, not because he wanted to, but because his mind started working. He pulled back slightly, looked at his mother with red-rimmed eyes, and asked in a voice that hadn't yet found its right tone, "How long have you been here? Long enough to know everything." It was Helen who answered. Vivian stood up from the armchair. "Ryan, darling, sit down." "You sit down, Vivian," Helen said, with a voice that didn't rise, didn't tremble, didn't ask. A voice that simply informed her there was no other option. Vivian stood motionless for a second, and then sat. Helen placed the envelope on the table, then looked at Marcus and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Marcus opened his jacket and placed his documents next to the envelope. Vivian looked at the envelope, looked at the documents, looked at Marcus, and for the first time since Helen had entered that house, her composure didn't recover in seconds. It remained cracked, visible, real. She took 2 steps back towards the dining table, and the sudden movement made her arm brush against its edge, knocking over a stack of plates waiting to be put away. The sound was loud and sharp, white shards scattering across the living room floor like pieces of something that could no longer be reassembled. No one moved to pick them up. Ryan looked at the broken pieces on the floor, then at Vivian, then at the documents on the table, and when he raised his eyes to his wife, Helen saw something on her son's face she had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was the expression of someone who has just understood that the life they believed they had built wasn't quite what they thought, and who was now finally lucid enough to face it. The shards of the plates remained on the floor. No one had moved to pick them up, and there was something right about that, as if that entire mess was the physical representation of what was happening in that room. Things that had seemed whole a moment before were now scattered, irreparable, impossible to return to what they were. Vivian stood near the dining table, her arms crossed, with the posture of someone still trying to find a way out, even when all the doors have already closed. Ryan was sitting on the sofa with the documents in his lap, reading, rereading, running his fingers over the pages as if he needed touch to confirm what his eyes were seeing. Marcus stood quietly by the window. He had delivered what he had, and now he understood that the rest was between these 3 people. Helen remained standing in the center of the room, not because she was staging anything, but because her legs simply had no intention of giving way. It was Ryan who spoke first. His voice was low, devoid of drama, the way true questions are asked, with no room for a rehearsed answer. "How long?" Vivian didn't answer immediately. She uncrossed her arms, looked to the side, and when she turned her face back to her husband, there was something different in her expression. It wasn't the usual calculated smile. It was something else, rawer, more tired, like someone who has carried a weight for too long and is starting to feel their knees buckle. "Since the beginning," she said, and the honesty of those 3 words was more frightening than any lie she could have told. Ryan closed his eyes for a few seconds. When he opened them, he looked at Helen. "You knew all this before you came here?" "I discovered it bit by bit," Helen replied. "But I knew something was very wrong before I took the first step into this house. Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you just tell me?" Helen looked at her son with the clarity of a mother who doesn't need to beat around the bush. Because you wouldn't have believed me. For months, Ryan, your judgment has been compromised by something they've been putting in your drink every night. I needed proof. I needed you to see it with your own eyes. The silence that followed was heavy. Ryan looked at Vivian with an expression Helen never wanted to see on her son's face. That expression of someone who truly loved and is processing that their love was used as an instrument. Did you ever love me? He asked Vivian. As simple as that. No accusation, no shouting, just the most honest question a betrayed man can ask. Vivian opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and it was at that moment that the bungalow's front door opened. No one had called for Elaine. She entered with a small box in her hands and the look of someone who has made a difficult decision after a long period of doubt. That expression of relief mixed with fear that appears when conscience finally overcomes silence. She stopped at the entrance of the living room, saw the broken plates on the floor, saw Ryan on the sofa, saw her sister leaning against the dining table, and finally saw Helen. When Elaine's eyes met Helen's, she took a deep breath. I had to come, she said, to everyone, but looking at her sister, I can't stay quiet anymore. Vivian straightened her body. Elaine, go home. This isn't enough, Viv. Elaine's voice didn't rise, but it had a weight that cut through the air in the room. It's enough. You've spent your whole life believing a story that wasn't true, and I kept quiet because I was scared of you, but I'm not going to anymore. Vivian turned pale. Elaine placed the box on the table next to Marcus's documents, opened it slowly, and took out a bundle of letters. Old envelopes, some yellowed at the edges, with their mother's handwriting on the front of each one. I found these letters at the back of Mum's wardrobe after she passed, Elaine said, looking at Ryan now. She wrote them but never sent them. They're confessions of what she did, what she made up, what she put into Vivian's head since we were children. Helen felt her legs finally grow heavy, but she didn't give in. Ryan looked at the letters, then at Helen. What is she talking about? Helen took a deep breath. Vivian's mother was my neighbor, Ryan, many years ago, in another life. She borrowed money from many people using my name, without my knowledge. When I found out and told the truth to the people in our block, she lost everything she had built there, and left with her daughters. She spent the rest of her life telling them that I had destroyed their family out of malice. Ryan stared at his mother without blinking. Vivian grew up believing that, Helen continued. And when she found out you were my son, she decided she would use you to settle a score that was never real. The silence that fell was different from all the other silences that afternoon. It was deeper, fuller. Ryan stood up slowly and looked at Vivian with an expression that was no longer pain, but understanding. And sometimes, understanding hurts more than anything else. Did you know your mother's story wasn't true? He asked her. Vivian didn't answer. Vivian? She closed her eyes. I didn't want to know, she finally said, her voice having lost all its composure. It was easier to believe. It was easier to have a reason. A reason for what? She opened her eyes and looked at him. And what was in that gaze was the most complicated thing Helen had seen in a long time. It wasn't coldness. It was a woman who had built an entire identity on a lie, and now, without it, no longer knew who she was. To get to you, Vivian said softly. In the beginning, it was the plan. It was all calculated. But later, her voice trailed off. Later, it wasn't. Ryan looked at her for a long moment, then turned to Elaine. Do these letters prove what your mother did? They prove everything, Elaine confirmed. Every detail. She knew she was wrong. She knew Helen was not to blame for anything. She wrote it all down. She just never had the courage to say it while she was alive. Ryan nodded slowly. He picked up the letters, looked at them for a moment, and placed them carefully on the table, as if respecting their weight, even though he had never asked to carry it. Then he looked at Helen, and without a word, he went to his mother and hugged her again. This time, it wasn't the hug of shock, of discovery, of sudden recognition. It was the hug of a son who had just understood the magnitude of what his mother had done for him, how much she had given up, how much she had endured in silence inside that house, in an apron, serving coffee to the woman who was using him as a pawn in a game of revenge, all to get close enough to protect him. Helen buried her face in her son's shoulder and closed her eyes. Auntie Susan had appeared at the entrance to the living room at some point. No one had noticed when. She stood there, hands clasped in front of her, her eyes full, unable to hide any of what she was feeling. Marcus looked at the floor. Elaine stood with her hands on the box of letters, looking at her sister, and Vivian stood near the dining table, alone in the middle of that room, full of people, surrounded by the shards of the plates that still no one had gathered, and by the weight of everything she had built on a foundation that never existed. Helen pulled away from her son gently, wiped her eyes, and looked at Vivian. What appeared on Helen's face in that moment made Elaine hold her breath, made Marcus look away, and made Ryan stand completely still. It wasn't anger. It wasn't triumph. It was compassion. The difficult, real kind of compassion, the kind that costs dearly. The compassion of a woman who looks at the person who tried to destroy her son and manages to see, underneath it all, a child who grew up believing a lie and didn't know how to get out of it. "I know what it's like to grow up hearing a story that shapes everything you believe," Helen said to Vivian, her voice steady. "I won't hold on to anger for you. But what you did to my son needs to stop now, and you need to find who you are without this story." Vivian looked at Helen for a long moment, and then, for the first time since Helen had set foot in that house, Vivian truly cried. Vivian left the bungalow late that afternoon. It wasn't a dramatic exit. There were no slamming gates, no shouting, no scenes. It was a silent departure, the kind that says more than any words could. She took a small suitcase, just the essentials, and as she passed through the living room where Helen was still standing, she paused for a second at the doorway. She looked at Ryan. He was sitting on the sofa, hands clasped, staring at the floor. He didn't lift his face. Then, Vivian looked at Helen and said in a voice that had lost all its polish and construction, a raw voice from within that was perhaps her real voice for the first time, "I thought I could manage not to feel anything. I thought it would be easy." Helen didn't reply. She just looked at her in silence. "It wasn't," Vivian finished, and walked through the door. The sound of her footsteps faded down the corridor, then down the service stairs, then into the afternoon silence. Ryan remained still for a long moment, then took a breath, a deep, slow breath, like someone relearning how to use their lungs properly, and fell quiet. Helen went to the sofa and sat beside her son without saying a word. She placed her hand on his, and they sat like that, the two of them in silence, as the afternoon light changed color outside. Because sometimes love doesn't need words. Sometimes it's exactly that, presence, just presence. In the days that followed, the bungalow began to feel lighter, not all at once. It happened gradually, like when a window that has been shut for too long is opened, and the air slowly filters in, renewing every corner without rush. Ryan slept for 2 consecutive nights without the tea, and on the morning of the 3rd day, he woke with a clarity in his eyes that Helen hadn't seen in a very long time. He didn't say anything about it, but he went to the kitchen, made coffee himself, and sat at the table with his mother as if they did this every morning of their lives. Dr. Leong came to the bungalow a few days later. He examined Ryan, talked with him, reviewed the notes Helen had kept, and confirmed what they already knew. With complete withdrawal from the substance, Ryan's system would make a full recovery. He said it would take a few weeks, that the process would be gradual, but there would be no permanent damage. Helen listened to this while sitting on a chair in the living room and remained silent for a moment, that Dr. Leong understood without needing an explanation. Then she simply said, "Thank you," and Dr. Leong nodded, picked up his briefcase, and left with his usual discretion. Marcus showed up one afternoon without calling first. Ryan received him on the veranda. The two of them stayed there for almost 2 hours. With coffee growing cold on the table, neither of them in a hurry to end the conversation. Helen didn't hear what they said, but from the kitchen window, she saw the moment Ryan placed a hand on his friend's shoulder and shook his head with that gesture of someone saying he's okay, he'll be okay, he understands. And she saw the moment Marcus lowered his head with the weight of someone who had carried guilt for too long. When Marcus was leaving, he passed by the kitchen, stopped at the entrance, and looked at Helen. He said nothing for a few seconds. Then he spoke in a low voice. "You did what none of us had the courage to do. Thank you." Helen nodded. "Always take care of him." Elaine returned 3 days later with a smaller box. Just Serene's letters, separated from the other things, tied with a simple string, as if they were something that needed to be delivered with care. The two women sat in the bungalow's kitchen on an afternoon, when Ryan had gone out to handle some company matters, the first steps back to a real routine, without fog, without an invisible weight on his shoulders. Elaine told Helen what she didn't yet know in detail, how she had found the letters, how she had read them all in one night and been unable to sleep, how she had held onto them for a while, trying to decide what to do. She told her how she had tried to talk to Vivian before, how her sister had rejected the conversation with a hardness that hurt because it came from a place of fear, not certainty. She didn't want the story to be a lie, Elaine said, because if it was a lie, then she had destroyed her own life and other people's lives for nothing. Helen looked at the bundle of letters on the table. It wasn't for nothing. she said slowly. It was for a real pain. The pain is real even when the story that caused it is not. Elaine looked at her. How can you be so clear-headed after everything that's happened? Helen thought for a moment. Because I'm a mother too, and I know what a mother is capable of passing on to her children without realizing the fears, the grudges, the twisted versions of the stories she's lived. Serene was wrong, very wrong, but Vivian was a victim of it too. Elaine nodded, her eyes full. Before she left the letters with Helen. I think you should be the one to decide what to do with these. That night, Helen sat alone with the letters in the kitchen for a long time. She read some, not all. A few were enough. They were exactly as Elaine had described. Serene's handwriting, the confession of someone who knew she had done wrong and didn't have the courage to fix it in life. In some, there was bitterness. In others, a regret that seemed genuine, the kind that shows up too late, but shows up nonetheless. Helen looked at the last letter for a few minutes, then got up, went out to the yard, and stood under the open sky with the letters in her hand. She didn't burn them, didn't tear them. She folded them carefully, placed them inside a new envelope, and put it away. Not because she needed to keep them as proof, but because those letters were part of a story that had shaped an entire family. And stories, even the painful ones, deserve to be kept with respect. Over the weekend, Ryan suggested they visit the HDB estate where he had grown up. He didn't say why. Helen didn't ask. They took the car early, before the traffic, and drove most of the way in silence. A good silence, the kind that exists only between people who don't need to fill the air to feel close. The neighborhood was almost the same, the covered walkways, the blocks packed together, the corner coffee shop with the same faded sign. The flat where they had lived now belonged to another family, a young one, with a child's bicycle leaning against the gate and a potted plant on the windowsill. Ryan stopped the car in front and just looked for a moment. I remember everything, he said. I remember you waking up before the sun. I remember the smell of the kopi that was already ready when I came out. I remember one time I needed money for school supplies and you just said it was settled. Only much later did I understand what you had to do to settle it. Helen said nothing. She looked at the small flat, her eyes glistening. I drifted away, Ryan continued. I know it wasn't just Vivian's fault. I let it happen. I chose to believe the excuses because it was easier than facing that something was wrong. You were being drugged, Ryan. It was before that, too, he interrupted gently. Before any substance, I was already pulling away. I became ashamed of it. Helen turned her face to her son. Ashamed of what? Ryan took a moment. Of having become so successful and having forgotten where I came from. The silence that followed was one of those that are heavy, but a good kind of heavy, like a blanket on a cold night. Helen took her son's hand, squeezed it, and said the simplest and truest thing there was to say. You didn't forget. You just got a little lost, and getting lost is part of the journey, as long as you find your way back. Ryan looked at his mother and, for the first time in a long, long time, he smiled. A real smile, with his eyes, with his whole face. The smile Helen had known since he had milk teeth and knees that were always scraped from running around. They stayed there in front of the little flat for a while longer, in no hurry, with nothing left to prove or discover or protect. Just the two of them, the way it had always been, the way, deep down, it had never stopped being.